Today you're going to learn all about variables in Python, how they work, how to use them, and what they are. Let's get right into it. First of all, we must ask ourselves the question, what are variables? Well, variables can be thought of as little drawers that contain bits of information, and each of those drawers has a name. For example, you could have a variable that stores a number in it, or you could have a variable that stores a name. In Python, we define these variables as soon as we assign them a value. So we don't really have to create the drawer. More or less, the drawer just gets created once we try to assign a value. For example, if how we do this is, let's say I have a variable, let's call it number, and we just say it equals, and then let's say 10. Now, this assignment is not to be confused with an equation. We aren't saying that these two things are equal. What we're actually trying to say is that we want to set this to be equal to this. And as I was saying earlier, we didn't have to already have this variable number defined. We could just assign a value. Now, there are multiple different types of data or information we can put in these variables. For example, we just saw here that we can have a number in it, but we can also have text. And when we are trying to put text in a variable in Python, or a string as we call it, we would use either single quotes or double quotes. Whichever you use doesn't really matter, but I like to use single quotes. So I could do something like, and this would be in our variable. Notice we are putting this value into this variable. We can also have Boolean values, like we could have a Boolean, which could be, let's say, true. And it can also be false. When you're working with Booleans, make sure you capitalize. Otherwise, it won't mean the same thing. Now, these variables are all good and well, but we can also output them using the print statement. We just type print, and then in parentheses what we want to print. We can put in one value, let's say we wanted to print number, but then we can also have multiple values separated by commas. We can print the number, text, and we can even put individual values into here as well, like just putting a number or a string in as well. And we can see that this all works. See? And all of our values were printed out one after another. Now that we have these variables, we see that we can use them to store information, but we can also act upon them. For example, we can take this number that we have here, and let's say we created another number. Let's just have num1 is equal to 10, and num2 is equal to 5. We can have all of our basic operations for numbers. We can have addition, which works as one would expect. We can have subtraction, multiplication, which is represented by the asterisk, and division represented by the forward slash. Notice with all of our other values we were getting out integers, but now we are getting a decimal point. This is called a float. since it has a floating point value attached to it. In Python, whenever you try to divide two numbers, even if they are integers and their result is also an integer, you will always get your result as a floating point number. To counteract this, you can have a double forward slash to tell Python you want integer division, and we can see that works as we would expect, and just gives us a plain integers. We can also directly manipulate these values as so. For example, we can take num1 and set it equal to 10 plus num2. And we can see that works, as it is now 15. Now, a lot of times in programming, you might want to also increase a number of a variable by a certain amount. So you might want to increment a certain variable by 1 or 5, or maybe even decrement them. Now, the simple way that is more intuitive, I would say, is to just set it equal to itself plus 1 or minus 1, or however you may wish. However, since this is so common in programming, programmers have made a shorthand for it. We can just say plus equals 1 to increase it by 1, and notice that works, as we now have 11. Now, the same thing can be done with minus equals, times equals, and divide equals. Now, that's for integers, but what about strings? As for strings, if we have two strings, we have similar operations we can perform on them. For example, with strings, we can concatenate them by adding them together, which basically means we're going to take them and squish them together. For example, and notice they are just squished together and combined into one string. And this is done with the addition symbol. There is one last thing about variables I am going to show you, and that is arrays. An array is basically a list. For example, we can have an array of names, and arrays are defined with brackets. Now, an array is, like what I said, a list. It's basically just a bunch of elements which are individual pieces of data put together into one long list. For example, you can put here Bob, Joseph, and Carol. And we have this array of elements. Now, the way we can, first of all, we can print the whole entire list just by printing our array, which would give us as we would expect. But what if we want just the first element of the list? We want just Bob's name. Well, then we would put in brackets next to it, and then we would put the index. So we might put 1, trying to get Bob, the first element. However, when we try to run this, we'd notice we'd get Joseph's. Is this a bug? Well, no, because in most programming languages, arrays are 0 indexed, meaning that the first element is actually given an index of 0. So this is actually the 0th element, and this is the first, and then the second. While this may not make much sense now, it is very useful in much later. So now if we try to put 0 here instead, we'll notice that we get the correct first element, which is Bob. Thank you for watching this video, and remember to like and subscribe.